Dawn came thin and pale over the Wyoming territory, slipping through the slats of a weathered barn like a promise it might not keep. Dust drifted in the quiet, floating the way prayers do when no one is sure who is listening. Zoltana stood at the edge of the yard, boots worn soft by miles of asking nothing, her breath steady despite the cold that pressed into her bones. She was only 20, yet her eyes carried the weight of seasons that had learned to leave without goodbye, and she wondered if this place would turn its back too. She had rehearsed her words all night, shaping them carefully so they would not sound like need. Need frightened people here, made them tighten their jaws and look away. What she carried instead was resolve, wrapped in humility, tied neatly like the bundle at her feet. When she stepped closer to the barn, she could hear a man moving inside, slow, deliberate sounds, the rhythm of someone who trusted his own solitude. Her heart knocked once, then settled because there was no room left for fear. Nayati Blackhorse noticed her shadow before he saw her face. 30 years had taught him how to read land and weather, how to sense change before it announced itself. He straightened from his work, dust on his hands, shoulders broad with the quiet strength of a man who did not waste motion. The sight of her caught him off guard, not because she was unexpected, but because he recognized that look in her eyes, the one that comes from surviving too much alone. He felt something tighten in his chest and told himself it was none of his concern. "I won't be a burden," Zoltana said, her voice soft but steady like water over stone. "I'll clean your barn. I'll work for what I eat." She did not step closer, did not bow her head, only held herself with a dignity that asked for nothing extra. The words hung between them, fragile and brave, and for a moment the world seemed to wait on his answer. Nayati's silence stretched longer than politeness allowed. He looked past her, toward the open land, toward memories he had buried under years of discipline and distance. He knew what the town said about girls like her, about kindness mistaken for weakness, about how quickly lines blurred when compassion entered a man's life. "I don't need help," he said finally, his voice calm, measured, colder than he intended. "And I don't take on trouble." The words fell heavy, and even as he spoke them, he felt the cost settle in his bones. Zoltana did not flinch. She nodded once as if she had expected nothing else, and gathered her bundle without a word. Shame flickered across her face, brief and controlled, then vanished behind something stronger. She turned away, each step deliberate, refusing the small mercy of looking back. Nayati watched her go, unsettled by the way her departure felt louder than any plea could have been. The town swallowed her quickly as it always did with those who lived at its edges. Zoltana found work where she could, scrubbing floors, mending fences, cleaning stalls others avoided. Nights were spent under borrowed roofs or open sky, her body aching but her spirit intact. She told herself that survival was a language she already knew, and that loneliness was simply another landscape to cross. Still, when she passed the barn at the edge of town, her steps slowed, and she wondered what might have been said differently. Nayati heard her name in fragments, carried on careless voices at the general store, in half-finished sentences meant to amuse. Each mention stirred an unease he tried to ignore. He worked longer hours, kept his hands busy, his thoughts contained. Yet in the quiet moments, when the barn settled and the land breathed, he saw her standing there again, asking only for work, and felt the weight of his refusal press deeper. The storm came without warning, rolling in from the plains like a reckoning. Wind tore at the land, rain slashing sideways, leaving no shelter untested. Zoltana ran until her lungs burned, the barn lights a dim promise through the sheets of rain. She did not knock, there was no pride left for that. She slipped inside, soaked and shivering, and began to work by instinct, sweeping water and mud away as if motion itself could keep her upright. Nayati found her there, bent over her task, hair plastered to her face, hands raw and trembling. For a heartbeat neither spoke. The storm roared outside, but inside the silence was louder. He took a blanket from the tack room and held it out, his gesture simple, almost shy. She accepted it with a nod, wrapping herself without thanks, without apology. In that quiet exchange, something shifted, unspoken and irreversible. Morning crept in slowly, light spilling across the barn floor. Zoltana was still there, finishing what she had started, her movements careful, respectful. Nayati watched her from the doorway, the lines he had drawn around his life beginning to blur. He did not tell her to leave. She did not ask to stay. Between them grew a fragile understanding, built not from words but from the shared knowledge of endurance. Days passed, then weeks. Zoltana worked and Nayati let her. Meals appeared where they could be found, water was drawn without comment, and silence became a language they both understood. The town noticed, judgment sharpening like a blade, but within the barn, there was only the steady rhythm of coexistence. Zoltana felt herself standing taller, not because she was claimed, but because she was respected. Nayati felt the slow thaw of a heart long guarded, and wondered how long such quiet grace could last. When the town finally spoke too loudly, when cruelty dressed itself as humor and cut too close, Nayati stepped forward, not with fists but with words that carried weight. He did not defend her as a possession, but as a person deserving of dignity. Zoltana stood beside him, her presence unwavering, and for the first time she saw herself reflected without shame. That night she packed her things, believing that dignity sometimes meant leaving before it was taken. At dawn, Nayati followed her, the land stretching wide and uncertain before them both. What was said then was simple, restrained, and honest, offered without demand. Zoltana listened, her face unreadable, then turned back toward the barn, her steps slow but certain, leaving him to decide whether he would follow into the life they were only beginning to imagine. Nayati watched her walk back toward the barn, her silhouette thinning in the early light, and for the first time in years he felt fear not as danger but as possibility. He followed at a distance, boots pressing into damp earth, wondering how many moments in a life were quietly decisive like this one. When he reached the barn, she had already set her bundle down, as if she had never meant to leave at all, and the air between them trembled with words still unspoken. They did not speak of agreements. Instead, the days resumed with a gentler rhythm, as though the land itself had exhaled. Zoltana worked alongside him now, not apart, her presence woven into the small rituals of the place. She learned the habits of the horses, the way Nayati preferred his tools laid out, the hours when silence was welcome and when it felt heavy. Each shared glance carried a question neither dared to voice yet, and the curiosity of what might grow there lingered like a held breath. The town did not soften overnight. Eyes followed them, conversations paused when they entered a room, and judgment clung stubbornly to old habits. Zoltana felt it keenly, the familiar tightening in her chest, but something had shifted. She no longer shrank under it. Nayati noticed this change before she did, the way she met stares calmly, how her steps stayed steady. He admired her resilience quietly, wondering when respect had begun to feel like affection. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the barn in gold, Nayati found himself repairing a broken stall door while Zoltana held the lantern. Their hands brushed briefly, a simple accident that sent a surprising warmth through them both. Neither pulled away immediately. In that pause lived 1,000 unasked questions. About trust, about the cost of caring, about whether two guarded lives could truly share shelter. The lantern flickered, shadows dancing, and the moment passed, leaving its echo behind. Zoltana lay awake that night listening to the sounds of the land settling. She thought of her mother's stories, of love spoken through action rather than promise, of partnerships built slowly like fires that last. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by survival alone. The thought frightened her more than hunger ever had, and yet it felt like standing at the edge of clear water, unsure but willing to step in. Nayati too wrestled with his thoughts beneath the same sky. He remembered the lessons of restraint, the warnings about attachment, and weighed them against the quiet strength Zoltana brought into his life. He realized that protecting himself had become a kind of loneliness he no longer wished to defend. The barn, once a refuge from the world, now felt like a place where something fragile and real was taking shape. Morning came with its usual tasks, but beneath them ran a deeper current. They moved around each other with new awareness, careful not to rush what was still forming. Each small kindness, a shared meal, a steady word, became an act of trust. And though neither knew how the story would end, both sensed they were standing at the beginning of something that asked patience, courage, and the willingness to be seen, even when the path ahead remained uncertain. Time settled into a gentle rhythm, as if the land itself approved of their union. The barn, once a place of solitude, now hummed with shared labor and quiet laughter. Zoltana and Nayati moved together seamlessly, each small gesture, drawing water, feeding the horses, stacking hay, becoming an unspoken promise of partnership. Words were few, but their actions spoke louder than any declaration ever could. The town, though still whispering, could no longer touch what had been quietly built. Love, in its patient and restrained form, had taken root. One morning, as sunlight poured through the barn slats, Zoltana paused to watch Nayati at work. She saw not just the man who had once refused her help, but someone capable of deep care, steadfast and tender. She smiled, feeling the weight of all her past struggles dissolve into dignity and belonging. Years later, standing side by side under the open sky, They would remember the first stormy night when their paths collided. It seemed then a test, but now it was a blessing. Their lives intertwined, a quiet, steady fire of mutual respect and love. And as the wind drifted over the plains, a lesson lingered in the heart. True connection is not claimed, it is chosen every day with patience, courage, and the courage to be seen. They had found not just love but home, in each other, in the land, and in the quiet grace of a life well lived.